Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The city, known for its splendor at night, witnessed a very different view of the sky, one that is usually painted by the city's kill lamp. Now it had turned into a sea of fiery red. The wind carried the sound of burning buildings, crackling, accompanied by the panicked screams of residents trying to save themselves. The air was filled with the smell of burnt smoke and fear that could almost be felt on the skin. The fire came suddenly like a hungry and ferocious living creature. It began in an old warehouse in the industrial area and spread quickly through the dry summer wind. Building after building gave way. Old wood became easy prey, and even concrete could not last long. In a matter of hours, the fire had spread to the residential area. In one corner of the city stood a small mosque called the Nurul Salam Mosque. It was not a large or luxurious building, just a simple place of worship with faded white walls and a small silver dome that shone softly. This mosque had stood for more than 5 decades, a silent witness to various events, both big and small, that colored the journey of the city. For some people, the mosque was a place of peace, where they sought tranquility from the hustle and bustle of the city. But for others, the mosque was a symbol of something foreign, something they did not understand or did not want to understand. The tension had long existed, though veiled in the banalities of everyday life. When the fire began to approach the surrounding area, many feared for the mosque. Flames licked at the walls and the roof threatened to collapse. Many thought the mosque would suffer the same fate as the buildings around it. However, something strange happened. As the fire approached the mosque's courtyard, it seemed to lose its strength. The old iron fence that surrounded the mosque remained cold and untouched. The embers left the small trees around it intact. The courtyard of the mosque was not burned, while other trees in the area had turned to charcoal. The fire seemed to have stopped and was unable to reach the building, as if there was an invisible force protecting it. The residents who witnessed the scene were silent, amazed, and confused. An old man who had lived in the area for more than 30 years could only shake his head. "I've seen fires before, but something like this doesn't make sense," he muttered while looking at the mosque from afar. When morning came, the destruction caused by the fire was clearly visible. The entire area had turned into rubble. Houses, streets, and other buildings were destroyed. But in the midst of the destruction, the Nurul Salam Mosque stood strong without the slightest damage. Its silver dome still shone in the morning sun, in stark contrast to the ashes and charcoal that surrounded it. News of this miracle quickly spread. The remaining residents began to gather at the site to see for themselves what had happened. Some considered it a miracle, a sign of divine protection, an event that defied human logic. Others looked on with disbelief and suspicion. "Why is only the mosque safe?" asked a young woman to her friend. "Why are our houses destroyed while that building remains untouched?" At first, such thoughts were just whispers. Over time, however, they turned into louder rumors. Those who had been indifferent to the mosque now began to see it with different eyes filled with dislike, which slowly turned into hatred. The days following the fire were a time of confusion for the residents of Los Angeles. Local and national media outlets were busy reporting on the disaster, calling it one of the most destructive fires in the city's history. But behind the reports of damages and fatalities, a small story began to steal the spotlight: the miracle of the Nurul Salam Mosque, which remained standing strong amidst the destruction. Journalists flocked to the scene, carrying cameras and microphones. They recorded images of the simple white building, untouched by the raging fire. The silver dome reflected the sunlight, creating the impression that the mosque was not only safe, but also preserved by an unseen force. Many wrote stories about divine protection, and a number of religious figures called this event a miracle. However, amidst the praise, whispers of suspicion began to be heard among the residents. How could such an old building survive? "It's not a miracle. There must be something there," said a middle-aged man in a coffee shop that was starting to reopen after the fire. Several people around him nodded in agreement. "Maybe they kept chemicals inside, something that put out the fire," he added. His eyes narrowed as if searching for the truth behind the lies he believed in. The previously hidden tension began to surface. The Nur al-Alam Mosque, which for years had been a small part of life in the area, was now the center of attention for most of the Muslim residents who usually worshiped there. They had lost their homes in the fire and were now gathering in the mosque yard, seeking shelter. Meanwhile, the scene provoked emotions among some non-Muslim residents who felt that the mosque had taken over public space. "The mosque should be demolished," said a young woman at a community meeting held in the makeshift town hall. "Not only because of this fire, but from the beginning, the mosque didn't belong here. It changed our environment." Voices of support emerged from the corners of the room. Those who had previously been silent now felt they had a reason to speak up. Meanwhile, Sarah, one of the Muslim residents present at the meeting, could only keep her head down, trying to hold back her anger. This tension quickly escalated. As the evening progressed, small groups began to gather around the mosque, discussing in hushed but fervent tones. Some emotionally considered approaching the authorities to request the mosque's destruction under the pretext of safety, while others dared to make plans to act on their own. On the other hand, the Muslim religious leaders at the mosque remained steadfast in their belief that the mosque was protected by a greater power. "From humans or otherwise, whatever happens, we will not give up the mosque just like that," said an old imam with a long white beard. He spent his nights inside the mosque, praying devoutly, believing that this test was part of a bigger plan. But night after night, the atmosphere around the mosque grew increasingly tense. Residents who had lost everything in the fire looked at the mosque with a mixture of suspicion and anger. Those who had previously only complained now began to take more concrete action. Small acts of vandalism appeared on the mosque's fence wall, while small stones were thrown at the mosque's windows at night. But even though these small attacks occurred, the mosque still stood strong. Not a single graffiti remained for long. The stones thrown were never strong enough to break the window glass. This phenomenon further strengthened the beliefs of Muslim citizens, but also fueled the anger of their opponents. They started to feel that the mosque was a threat, not only physically, but also symbolically. "This is no coincidence," said an old man, known as an influential figure in the community. "The mosque is the embodiment of something against us. We can't let this continue. If the government doesn't act, we have to act." Small groups began gathering at several points around the destroyed neighborhood. They were planning something more than just vandalism. The fire that once devoured the neighborhood seemed to be coming back. This time, it was intentionally directed to destroy the mosque, which they saw as a symbol of division. What they did not know was that their plan would not go as expected. Nur al-Salam Mosque was not just a building. There was something bigger behind its white walls, something that had witnessed human chaos for centuries and still stood without wavering. The remains of a great fire still left their traces. Thin smoke rising from the rubble, charcoal strewn along the streets, and a warm chill lingering in the air. But in a small corner of the city, a darker atmosphere was brewing. In an empty building that survived the fire, a group of residents gathered with faces full of determination. They were not ordinary residents trying to restore their lives after the disaster. They were people who had let anger take over their hearts. "Look what is left of us," said a tall man with a deep voice. His face was covered in small burns from the fire a few days earlier. "We lost the family shop, the house, and the mosque." The mosque stood without the slightest damage. "Is it fair?" The group nodded in unison, as if they had found the common enemy they had been looking for. For them, the mosque was not just a building. "If the government is not going to do anything, we will act," the man continued. He then took out a rough map, showing the location of the mosque, complete with detailed notes on access roads and weak points they thought could be exploited. Their plan was simple but deadly. That night, they decided to light the fire again. They brought petrol, torches, and other tools needed to complete their mission. But as they started to move towards the mosque, something strange began to happen. The sky, which was previously dark and starless, slowly changed. Thick clouds gathered above the area, and the wind began to get stronger. The air temperature, which had been warm, suddenly became piercingly cold to the bone. In the yard, an old guard who was on duty that night stood in front of the door. His hands were clasped, his lips still muttering. He was looking into the distance, watching the shadows that were starting to move, approaching. As the group moved closer, the atmosphere around them felt different. The air became heavy, as if every step they took was a fight against an invisible force. But they decided to continue. They lit torches and started pouring petrol on the fence in the courtyard of the mosque. One of them, a man in a black leather jacket, stepped forward to throw the torch towards the building. That's when something extraordinary happened. The torch, which should have immediately hit the gasoline and created a small explosion, suddenly went out in the air. The flame burning at the tip of the torch just disappeared like a candle blown by the wind. The man froze, his hands shaking, unable to believe what he had just witnessed. "Why did the fire go out?" whispered one of them, his voice full of fear. They tried again. This time, two people came forward together, each carrying a torch. But the result was the same. Before the torches touched the petrol, the flames at their tips simply went out. The petrol they had poured showed no signs of igniting, even when they tried to light it with a match. "Something is wrong here," said a young woman in the group, her voice shaking. She slowly backed away, her eyes fixed on the mosque with a mixture of fear and awe. Meanwhile, inside the mosque, the old guard continued to pray with solemnity. He did not know the details of what was happening outside, but he could feel the presence of something greater than humans. The walls of the Masjid Asa vibrated softly, as if they were speaking in a language that only hearts full of faith could understand. The group finally decided to retreat, not keen to face the fear that began to creep up on them. They left behind a torch and their tools in the dark, their steps hesitant as they moved further away. Even though they had gone, the mother-in-law-like shadows still surrounded the mosque, with luminous eyes that watched them sharply. In their dreams, they heard a voice they couldn't understand, but it kept echoing in their minds even after they woke up. News of the failed attack quickly spread among the residents. Some saw it as a sign that the mosque was indeed protected by something divine. However, for those still consumed by hatred, they did not realize that every step closer to the destruction of the Nur Salam Mosque brought them closer to ruin. The Nur Salam Mosque was not just a building, it was a witness to something far greater than the fires of hatred or even human life. That night, Los Angeles fell into a heavy silence. Yet for those who had approached the mosque with ill intent, a curse lingered. In a shabby apartment on the edge of the city, one of the men awoke with his body drenched in cold sweat, his face pale and filled with terror. He had dreamed of being surrounded by black hooded figures, their silent stares piercing through him. In the center of the hall stood a giant figure, its fiery eyes locked onto him. Suddenly he found himself burning alive, punished for his deeds. His screams echoed through the apartment, waking the other residents. For the first time in his life, he felt genuine fear. But he was not the only one. Elsewhere, the other members of the group experienced similar nightmares. Each saw the same vision, the sturdy mosque, untouched by fire, standing as a bastion of faith, while they were overwhelmed by forces they could not fight. Each dream carried the same message. Some powers were beyond their comprehension, and their hatred would only lead to their downfall. Do not approach the mosque. One of them, a young woman who had previously participated in the attempted arson, could not. Holding back his fear, he woke up in the middle of the night and decided to leave town. With a small bag containing clothes and some money, he boarded the bus heading to Arizona, hoping to escape from the shadows of his dreams. But even on the way, he couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching him. The woman tried to tell her dream to a man, a passenger on the bus. An old grandmother sitting next to him, with a trembling tone, described the mosque, the bright light emanating from it, and the sounds that echoed in her mind. But the old grandmother just smiled and said, "Maybe it was a warning. Sometimes we need to hear a voice from above to remind us." The woman said nothing more. She just looked out the window, realizing that there was nothing far enough to escape from what was happening. Meanwhile, in the city, news of these dreams began to spread. The residents, who had previously only been spectators, began to feel afraid. Some believed that the mosque was truly protected by divine power. They began to come to the mosque, not to destroy it, but to seek protection. The more fanatic group, led by the tall man, saw these dreams as a form of provocation. For them, the mosque not only had to be destroyed, but also had to be fought with greater force. "What we are experiencing is an illusion," said the tall man in their secret meeting. "We cannot let fear control us. We will use explosions. We will dig to the root." The group began to collect explosives. They contacted dark contacts in suburbs to get what they needed, all done in the shadows of the night, away from the sight of police or other citizens. But every time they tried to design a plan, something strange happened. Their explosives suddenly got wet for no reason. The cables they connected broke on their own. Even one night they heard a voice, like a whisper in their ears. The person holding the PR stopped and immediately dropped what he was holding. Yerspa heard the voice, but close to the wind, no one admitted to hearing anything. This voice, with Kang's tone, carried a power that was not human. Some answered, but most just looked at each other with expressions of fear, increasingly apparent in the midst of it all. The mosque remained standing, untouched. The congregation who came to worship reported something strange yet calming. They felt an extraordinary sense of peace every time they entered the mosque. Some even claimed to see a soft glow of light inside the prayer room. Although no additional lights were installed, a cleric from out of town came to see the mosque. In a low voice, he said, "This is a sign that this mosque is protected. No human power can bring it down." But for the group trying to destroy the mosque, the cleric's words only fueled their anger. They decided to launch a final attack that night. As they prepared their plan, the city of Los Angeles felt a strange vibration. The sky turned gel-like, thick and ominous. Despite the lack of rain clouds, the wind roared loudly. Mawa voices echoed, only audible to those on the verge of destruction. A tall man stood in front of the van. His eyes were filled with determination but shadowed by doubt. For a moment, he felt as if something was holding him back. He shook off the feeling and said to his group, "We will finish what we started tonight." The atmosphere around the Nur al-Salam Mosque felt tense. The night wind blew hard, carrying sounds that were unexplainable to the residents, like a warning. But to the fanatic group, it was a moment to prove their resolve. Inside a warehouse far from the city center, the group prepared their attack carefully. The van, loaded with explosives, was ready. Wires were connected, triggers installed, and timers set. Everything seemed perfect, at least on paper. "I don't care anymore," said the tall man, his voice filled with anger. "Tonight, the mosque will disappear. No one can stop us." Yet in his heart, a small doubt began to grow. Nightmares continued to haunt him, and he could not ignore them. He tried to bury the fear with anger, but the image of the mosque standing firm always lingered in his mind, a memory he could not erase. When the clock struck 2 a.m., they moved. The van, carrying its deadly load, drove slowly. The usually vibrant city of Los Angeles felt eerily silent that night, as if the whole city was holding its breath. No police, no pedestrians, just a piercing silence. For the group, however, this silence felt like a threat. Inside the van, the tall man gripped the steering wheel tightly, sweat dripping down his temples. He tried to ignore the roaring voices in his mind, but they grew louder, haunting him as they approached their target. But the closer they got to the mosque, the louder the voices became. He turned to his colleagues in the back seat, hoping someone would speak. But all were silent. They just stared at him. Front with a tense expression, "You won't win this time," the voice was heard more clearly. The man shook his head, trying to chase it away. When they arrived near the mosque, the sight they saw left them speechless. The mosque stood in awe-inspiring silence, lit only by the light of the moon. But there was something strange above the dome of the mosque. A soft golden light seemed to shine like a lamp that never went out. It was like a source of energy that could not be explained. The tall man swallowed his saliva. He felt something was wrong but was too afraid to back down. He turned off the Mez Fatur Timer P explosives and gave the signal to the wind to get ready. "We finish this now," he said to Levi. To him joints dar, to them mangahelui vanawa. The stabbing happened as planned, but their first step towards the mosque brought a strangeness they never imagined. As soon as they approached the gate of the mosque, the temperature suddenly changed. A piercing cold wind blew, making them shiver. But more than that, they felt a strange pressure on their chests, like there was something prompting them to retreat. I can't breathe, one said in a choked voice. The tall man glared at him. Don't be weak. We've come too far to retreat now. Still, as they stepped closer, the strange phenomenon became more intense. The sound of whispers began to be heard, not from one direction, but from everywhere. The whispers repeated themselves over and over again in words they couldn't understand, but they were full of warnings. The tall man shouted, but before he could instruct Apun, a thunderous sound filled the air. It was a sound like the rumbling of the earth, but more alive, more personal. This is not you, when the wind hard hit them, like Bada tried to hold on, but no one could fight the power. In a matter of seconds, they were swept away by the invisible power of their bodies. Swept away like dry leaves in the middle of a storm. When the wind stopped, only silence remained. The mosque remained standing, firmly untouched, while the attackers were lying lifeless on the ground. The next morning, the townspeople found their bodies lying near the mosque. There were no obvious signs of violence or physical injuries, only expressions of fear etched on their faces, as if they had seen something they could not understand. The mosque remained standing, untouched. The worshippers who came for morning prayers looked at the scene in amazement, but also with a growing belief that the mosque was truly protected. News of the incident spread quickly, but no one could explain what really happened. The police concluded that the attack was an accident caused by the incompetence of the attackers. But for those who believe, that night was proof that there is a power greater than man. The power that kept the Nur al-Salam Mosque from destruction became a silent witness to human turmoil, filled with hatred and incomprehension. The remaining citizens of Los Angeles could only stare at him with a mixture of respect and awe, not as a story of destruction, but of the steadfastness of faith and strength that transcends human logic. The mosque is now not only a place of worship, but also a place of resistance against hatred and injustice. It stands as a reminder that what is protected by a power greater than man can never be destroyed. At night, the gripping one teaches a profound lesson, a monument unshaken by time or hatred, keeping peace amidst the hustle and bustle of the world. This is the end of our video. If you enjoy Islamic content like this, don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next video.